lost power in Spain, they were reclassified, they were relabeled. They're now called by Spanish Catholic authorities not moros anymore, or Moors. They're now called mudéjars, which means the ones permitted to remain, or the broken ones. They also use the term morisco, which means the little Moors. It's like calling you a boy. And these are things which are implemented by the 13th century and are now going into documents. It's now becoming, common practice to use that term. And we have to ask ourselves then, what does that do if you begin to relabel people, and especially with pejorative labels? Okay, and I'll get this in more detail when I talk about Nomo. So you have Negro, of course, being a term used to classify African captives. The countries of such captives were not recognized by their captors, and unfortunately, in time, the descendants of such captives would themselves forget their own national or ethnic origin. Such efforts by European leaders, the rulers, the merchants, the clerics, who were benefiting financially, the efforts by such leaders was designed to justify a quote-unquote enlightened Christian Europe. Europe's involvement in the highly dehumanizing business of chattel slavery required a justification for their less than humane and less than Christ-like acts. Such individuals sought to put the label of slave and primitive on as much of Africa as they could. This was a more difficult task, however, when it came to those peoples known as Moorish Muslims. It was a more difficult task because too much evidence existed of the highly organized and scientific civilization of the Moors. Even the great English writer, Shakespeare, or playwright, had taken the time to write a play revealing the great nobility, but human fallibility, of the Moorish character of Othello. This was a fact which even hateful Catholic Europeans would have to concede. In other words, Europeans could essentially lie more easily about African peoples who they didn't have a whole lot of contact with, those who lived below, say, the Senegal River. Europeans could more easily deny the legacy of such peoples because they were not yet in heavy contact with the European world. But the legacy of the Moors was indelible within the European culture. It existed in their coats of arms, it existed in their language, it existed in their blood. Such African peoples, those who came from the southernmost regions of West Africa, commonly shared phenotypes with what we would call Moors, but didn't always share the same culture, which of course makes sense. Nevertheless, on average, such West African captives tended to be darker in hue than those Moors who resided further north and in Andalusia. The southern region became a haven for captive hunters, and it acquired the label eventually by Europeans of the slave coast. Consequently, a synonymity began to develop between African persons with dark hues and that of a slave status. Europe's success in enslaving African peoples en masse had made this a reality. As a result, many people today are not accustomed to perceiving the medieval era Moors as anything other than light in complexion, a position which is not borne out by either written accounts or pictorial records. What I'm essentially saying is that the European world knew full well that a Moor could be someone of a very dark hue, and originally was, for obvious reasons, or someone of a lighter hue. But because of the enslavement trade, which is focusing on the southernmost areas of West Africa, it's called by the Spanish and the Portuguese the asiento, you have larger numbers of people coming from that area who are finding themselves enslaved. What's happening in the northernmost areas? Al-Mansur and other Moroccan and Moorish rulers are organizing as much as they can, using the religion of Islam as an organizing factor, to resist Catholic European encroachment. Their contact with the European world earlier had prepared them essentially to deal more effectively with keeping them at bay longer, but not forever. But as I say, now when people think very often of Moors, and when I've lectured on the Moors, and I've had people who are either historians or in other disciplines who didn't know a whole lot about the Moors who would come up and say, well, weren't the Moors essentially like, white or Caucasian? And I just looked at him and I said, no. What is that based upon? Well, I just thought, and then inevitably, you know where the thought leads to? The thought leads to not them actually having researched anything. The movies. The movies. That's right. Most people's, unfortunately, perspectives of historical reality are coming from films and Hollywood. So if we consider then that this is the source, then we should understand how important it is for us to start making more movies and more films, whether they're TV or documentaries, etc., which are beginning to do battle with these other images. And I have to say it, I don't understand how it is that we can have millionaires in sports and other people who don't get together and say, why don't we pool our money and make a film company that's dedicated to making historical films? So, again, I don't understand it. I do understand it, but I can't do anything about it unless I can get them in a class. Okay, let me show you some of these slides before I proceed here. Okay, I may have to. This is a 13th century. Thank you. This is a 13th century painting or drawing from a book called Alfonso's Chess Book. And you see Moors sitting playing chess. Now, one of the things, unfortunately, that has also occurred when you talk about the legacy of the Moors is because the Moors were Muslim, people tend to think that the term Arab and Moor are synonymous, and they're not. And it's unfortunate because in every other Islamic community that I know of, there are Chinese Muslims, there are Turkish Muslims, there are Persian Muslims, there are even German Muslims. But none of them is known as an Arab because they became Muslims. But the idea of making the Moors Arabs has everything to do with denying their Africanity. So you can't allow them to go, people say, unmolested in the Western tradition. And unfortunately, many Arab scholars, or many Arabs, period, go along with the idea of claiming something noble, even if it doesn't belong to them. This is from the family crests of Great Britain and Ireland. And these crests, again, this text was done by a European. And in fact, quick story behind this again in terms of trying to obfuscate who the Moors were. The first one, the sister with the bat's wings coming out of her head, that is the Morfin family, which was an Irish family. B in the middle is the Stewart family. C is the Maniot and Gleam family. D is the Halliburton family. E is the Mason family. And F is the Brocas family.